We're about to dive into some data that sparked a massive, and I mean massive, debate in Brazil. And it all started with one really provocative question about the country's entire education system.
Okay, that is a pretty shocking question, right? And I want to be super clear right from the start. That is not my opinion. But that exact phrase, word for word, became the spark for a huge online firestorm. And in this explainer, we're going to unpack the data that led to it.
So this was the actual title of a video from a huge financial channel, O Primo Rico. Now, they weren't just making this up. They were analyzing a giant international report to argue that Brazil's educational problems have some really severe consequences for people's wallets. So, what exactly is this report they were talking about?
To really get to the bottom of this claim, we have to look at the evidence. And it all comes from this big global study called PISA. You can think of it as a kind of thermometer for education systems all over the world.
Now, PISA isn't your typical school exam where you just memorize formulas to pass. Nope, it's run by the OECD, and its whole purpose is to see if 15-year-olds can actually apply what they've learned in math, reading, and science to solve real-world problems.
So we're not talking about abstract theory here. This is all about practical, everyday skills. Can a student look at a chart in a news article and actually understand what it means? Can they figure out basic interest on a loan? These are the kinds of skills you absolutely need to get by in the modern world.
And this is not some casual online poll. The way they do this is incredibly rigorous. Students are picked completely at random to make sure they represent the entire country. Then they sit down for a 2-hour test, and all the results are carefully analyzed so you can make fair comparisons between the 81 different countries that participate.
Okay, so let's get to the juicy part. What did the 2022 PISA results actually show for Brazil? This is the evidence that lit the fuse on that whole controversial video.
All right, here is the number that just floored everybody. 73%. That is the percentage of 15-year-old students in Brazil who are performing below the basic level of proficiency in math. Let that sink in. That means almost 3 out of every 4 students can't reliably solve simple, everyday math problems. And when you put Brazil's scores side by side with the average for OECD countries, which are mostly developed nations, you see this really big, consistent gap across the board. Just take a look at those numbers in math, reading, and science. The difference is stark.
This chart just makes that math gap crystal clear. It's almost a 100-point difference. Now, to give you some perspective, education experts say that a 30-point gap is roughly the same as 1 full year of school. So we are talking about a deficit that's equivalent to several years of learning. It's a huge deal.
So let's just boil this down. What are the key takeaways here? First, that math performance is a massive red flag, with 73% of students struggling. Second, there are very, very few top performers. Third, there's this enormous inequality gap. Wealthier students are literally years ahead of poorer students. And finally, there was a little bit of good news with a slight bump in reading, but the overall picture is, well, it's pretty challenging.
Okay, so now let's connect the dots here. That original YouTube video wasn't just some academic discussion about test scores. It made a very direct line between this educational data and the financial health of both the country and regular people.
The whole argument they make is that there are 2 very clear paths a country can go down. If you have quality education, you get higher productivity, a skilled workforce, and people who generally make smarter financial choices. But with the deficient education system, you get a stagnant economy and these terrible cycles of poverty where people are just way more likely to get trapped in debt or make bad investments.
And this really gets to the heart of their argument, this direct link. When a huge chunk of the population is what you might call functionally illiterate, meaning they can't fully grasp what they read or do basic calculations, they become incredibly vulnerable financially. I mean, think about it. If you can't confidently calculate a percentage, how are you going to spot a predatory loan? If you can't critically read a contract, how do you avoid a terrible deal? That's the vulnerability they're talking about.
Now, of course, there's another side to the story. Critics were quick to point out that the video's title was super sensationalist, maybe even demoralizing. They also make a good point that while PISA is a really powerful tool, it's not the be-all and end-all. It's a snapshot of skills at age 15, and it just can't capture the entire complex picture of a country's education system. So after we've looked at all the data and heard the arguments from both sides, what's the big picture takeaway here? Why does this PISA report really truly matter?
Well, the impact really ripples out on 3 different levels. First, for the economy, it means lower productivity and a serious skills gap. For society, it just makes that inequality we saw in the data even worse. And for you, as an individual, it can actually limit your own financial success and, honestly, make you more susceptible to scams and misinformation.
But look, the point of all this isn't to just throw our hands up in despair. It's about awareness. It's about being aware of how deeply education, or what economists call human capital, is connected to literally everything, from the nation's GDP all the way down to your ability to build a secure future for yourself. This data is a diagnosis. It is not a final verdict. And all of this leaves us with one final, really big question to think about. When we see the billions that are spent on education compared to these results, we have to ask ourselves, are we treating education like it's just another expense on a spreadsheet, or are we treating it like the single most critical investment that a country and that each of us can possibly make? Thanks for watching.